Hi there, psychology class. Welcome to Unit 3A on learning. We actually are going to start with classical conditioning as our first example of learning. And so before we even talk about classical conditioning, let's talk about the two main types of learning. Associative learning, which just means that we can learn things based on connecting events that happen together, and cognitive learning, which just means that you can acquire information just by observing and or listening to someone or something. And so this video is going to be an example of associative learning. And so our first example of associative learning is classical conditioning. It's called classical conditioning just because it's the classic or original view of learning. It was actually the first theory of learning that was developed. And the definition of classical conditioning is a type of learning in which we learn to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. And so this was actually discovered by Ivan Pavlov, who was a doctor. He wasn't even a psychologist at all. And so a Russian physiologist, there's his picture at the bottom of the screen. He has an awesome mustache, if you ask me. And what he was doing actually wasn't to learn about learning at all, but really what he was interested in was studying the relationship between the nervous system and digestion. And so he actually had a laboratory filled with dogs, and he was collecting and analyzing saliva levels of these dogs in an anticipation of learning something about, the digestive system and how the nervous system triggered saliva production and all this exciting stuff. And in actuality, he comes up with some amazing psychological theory. And so honestly, if you have a pet, you already understand classical conditioning. Okay, and so in his research of the digestive system, Pavlov discovered that these dogs in his lab didn't always wait until they had received their food to start salivating. Sometimes they salivated in anticipation of food. And so in other words, in theories of learning, they'd learn to associate certain sounds or objects with feeding time. And so that's why classical conditioning is called a form of associative learning. And so if you have a cat or a dog, you understand this completely, right? You walk in the kitchen and you open a cupboard door, even if it's not the one in which your pet's food is stored. Do they not come running in anticipation because they've learned to associate sounds in the kitchen with feeding time? And so it seems like such common sense to us now, but this was actually a very revolutionary idea in understanding how people and animals learn things. And so let's talk about the vocab involved with classical conditioning. This tends to be the stuff that confuses students the most. And so an understanding of the terminology will help you understand all the examples and the application problems that we do in class. Okay, the first thing to know is an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that causes a response that is automatic, right? And so think of stimulus as the cause and the response as the effect. And so your unconditioned response is going to be a reaction or response that is natural or unlearned. And an example, right? If I were to scream, I won't do that to you on a video. I don't want you jumping out of your seat. You would jump, right? Unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Nobody had to teach you to jump in response to a scream. Nobody has to teach your dog or cat to salivate when food is given to them. What we can do then, and this is what Pavlov ended up doing in his experiments, is if you associate that response, that natural or unlearned response, with something that initially means nothing to the learner, we're going to see learning occur. And so a neutral stimulus is just something that means nothing to the learner initially, right? It's not good, it's not bad, it's just neutral. And what we do is if we can connect that unconditioned stimulus and that neutral stimulus together, we can actually make a conditioned response, which is just a learned response to the stimulus that was previously unlearned. Okay? The conditioned stimulus is just the learned stimulus. A good thing to write down with this to help you remember this is that the conditioned stimulus or the learned stimulus used to be called the neutral stimulus prior to the learning occurring. And so just remember CS used to be called NS. And again, we'll do some practice examples in class to help you understand this further. Once we've learned this, that we can pair things together and get people to respond in a way to something new that they used to respond to something else just naturally, we can understand conditioning as Pavlov did. And so the 5 major conditioning processes here, we just call that initial stage when the neutral stimulus is linked with the unconditioned stimulus, so that we can make the neutral stimulus be a conditioned stimulus. We just call that acquisition, right? You've acquired the learning, or you've gained the knowledge. Obviously, you as a student know that not everything you have ever learned in life is something that you necessarily remember. So in classical conditioning terms, we just call that extinction. A conditioned stimulus no longer brings about a conditioned response. We would just say that that learning has become extinct, or it's went away. Spontaneous recovery, I guess, is an explanation as to why not everything forgotten is forgotten forever, and that's that a response that was previously extinct comes back. We just call that spontaneous recovery. Generalization is when you respond the same way to stimuli that are similar. A great example of that is any of you, maybe not so great of an example, but any of you that have ever had the flu, right? And you've gotten sick and you no longer eat a food anymore because it reminds you of having the flu. That probably was something that you acquired using this theory of classical conditioning. If there's anything similar to the food that you are associating with the flu that you no longer eat as well, that would be a generalization. And then the opposite of that would be discrimination, when you can respond differently to similar stimuli. And so the example of, well, actually, this isn't a fake example. This is a real life example. One time I ate a boatload of Fritos and got wicked sick. I'm not sure if it was the Fritos that made me sick, or, I just had the flu and it happened to coincide with me, chowing down on a bunch of Fritos. But as a result, haven't eaten Fritos to this day. Can't even look at them. Can't even smell them. Disgusting, right? They make me think of the flu. That associative learning happened using these terms of classical conditioning. Generalization would mean that I would not eat things similar to Fritos, right? Other corn chip type products, Doritos or Tostitos perhaps. But luckily for me, that is not the case. In actual terms, I can discriminate, meaning that I will eat things like Doritos or other corn chip type products, but still won't eat the Fritos. So that would be responding differently to similar stimuli. One of the most famous examples of classical conditioning was, I'm using finger quotes, you can't see me, an experiment done by John Watson and Rosalie Rayner in the 1920s. And it's just known in the books as the Little Albert experiment. And so there's a picture of Watson and Rayner with this baby, that they just borrowed from an orphanage to conduct psychological experiments on. I will tell you, it's not a true experiment in that we have no control group, we have no isolation of variables, and so I think that this is maybe mislabeled a lot, and probably it's just more of a case study in classical conditioning, or a pseudo experiment, if you will. And of course, ethics comes into question here. Really, traumatizing a baby, I'm not real sure is something that would be condoned in modern psychology. But here's what they did. So they borrowed this baby from an orphanage, and they, you can see Watson is holding in his hand a white lab rat. And so they showed the white lab rat to the baby and had the baby befriend the white lab rat. And once the baby was comfortable with being around the lab rat, they began to insert another stimulus so that the baby would begin to associate the stimulus of the rat with another stimulus. So we're going to call the rat the neutral stimulus, right? It's not good, it's not bad, it's just this cute little rat. The unconditioned stimulus that they begin to pair with the neutral stimulus of the rat is a loud noise. And so Watson and Rayner would stand behind little Albert, and anytime he went to touch or pet the white lab rat, they would begin to clang big metal pipes together. And so you can imagine an infant is sitting there, and every time it goes to touch this cute little furry rat, bang, 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 right? It has this loud sound that startles the baby. And so the unconditioned stimulus of the loud noise obviously causes the baby to respond unconditionally, right, naturally, by jumping and crying. And so with enough pairings of loud noise with rat, you begin to notice that, actually Watson and Rayner begin to notice that they don't even need to clang the metal pipes together, that just showing the what once neutral rat to the baby means that the baby will now start crying. And so you can see that the rat that was once neutral becomes the learned stimulus that causes the same reaction that metal pipes used to cause, right? So the loud noise used to naturally cause the baby to jump and cry, and now they've taught this baby to associate that sound with the rat, which means that the rat alone, the conditioned stimulus, will cause the conditioned response of fear or crying. And so, wow, two psychologists that taught an infant to fear something. The problem with this, ethically, right? Poor baby. Secondly, borrowed from an orphanage. Third, they returned little Albert, without working on reversing the effects. And so, sadly, this, poor little guy, might have been adopted, later, only to, live his adult life out being afraid of rats. Or, what if he generalized and began to fear everything white and furry? That would not be cool. And so that's, learned a lot from this pseudo experiment, but ethics could come into question here for sure. Okay, another example that will maybe help you understand this, and again, we will do lots more examples in practice in class, but is that certain drugs that are used to treat cancer can kind of cause people to become sick or nauseous. And so, unfortunately, that means that sometimes these patients that are going to hospitals for their drug treatment can become classically conditioned to feel nauseous just at the sights, smells, and sounds of the hospital. And so the hospital was the neutral stimulus, but once it became paired with the unconditioned stimulus of this medication, now the hospital alone can cause the same response of nausea. And another example is that sometimes people that are going through drug therapy or counseling to get over an addiction, their counselors will advise them to steer clear of people and settings that could trigger their cravings, right? And so there might be certain friends or certain places that they associate with their drug problem, and so the counselor will tell them, those are conditioned stimuli that can trigger your response of drug use, and so it's probably best to avoid those learned associations. Okay, and so there is classical conditioning for you. Thanks for listening. Bring your notes and questions to class with you, and again, we'll do lots of practice and examples together. Thanks.